My name is Kristen Covey, and I'm an educator with the King County Wastewater Treatment Division. And I am not the main speaker today. So I am playing the role of facilitator and tech support, hopefully. And our main speaker today is Monica Vanderveeren, and she is also a staff member with the King County Wastewater Treatment Division. So she will be delivering the talk, but we also have David Jackson here, who is a staff member with the Snohomish Conservation District, and he's the Community Conservation Program Manager there. So Monica and David delivered our last class, if you were at that. So we are really lucky to have them both back. And David will be in charge of managing the chat box. And I will get to the logistics of this class in a moment, but he has a very big role of managing all of the questions in the chat box. So we have two resources at our disposal today. So I'm just gonna spend a couple short minutes just going over a little background. So apologies to those of you who were at the last class. This is gonna be a repeat of what I did earlier, but for those of you that are new, I just want to provide a little context for you. So you might be wondering why two organizations located in two different counties, one of them being focused on wastewater treatment, are providing classes on sustainable yard care. And that's a great question. So the reason is because of a place called Brightwater. So Brightwater is King County's newest wastewater treatment plant that is constructed and located just across the Snohomish County line. So if you can see this blue dot on the small map, that's where Brightwater is located. King County shares not only an interest in improving water quality, we also share community members with the Snohomish Conservation District. So it made perfect sense for us to partner together and deliver some free classes to the community members that we serve. So there's an education center at the treatment plant, which is what this picture is of. It's not the wastewater treatment plant. This is our education center, and that's where we normally deliver these classes when we're in person. And I did put a slide up, or I should say a square on the slide of all the upcoming classes we have, in case you weren't aware, but they are every other Saturday, and they all will start at 10 a.m. and go till 11:30. So here are the upcoming classes. Okay, so I just wanted to include a couple details about the King County Wastewater Treatment Division. This is a map of our service area. So we clean water for everyone that lives in this region. You can see it's just over the Snohomish County line. And obviously cleaning wastewater is a huge part of what we do, but we also want to provide educational opportunities to support the communities we serve. So one way we do that is by offering these free classes to promote a healthy environment. And this is a photo of Monica and David in the flesh, teaching a class a couple years ago in person. And this is the education center at a different angle. We have a demonstration garden there that includes 3 large beds full of dahlias in the summertime, grown by a neighbor who is in this picture, Walt Jasenko. I know they're not native plants, but they are really, really beautiful. So if you do live in the area, I encourage you to come visit us in the future. So, all right, to the logistics. So hopefully, if everything goes according to plan and technology cooperates, we plan to leave about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of Monica's talk before 11:30 for Q&A. So just know that that's our hope, but we will be using the chat box for communicating today. So if you have questions during her presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box, and David will do his best to answer them as they come up. I will be taking note of any questions that did not get answered by David, and we will save those and ask those questions at the end. So don't fret if your question didn't get addressed in the chat box. You don't need to type it again. We will answer it at the end if it's a relevant question to the class. So, okay, let's get on with it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Monica can share her presentation.
So what I'm going to cover is I'm going to actually go over some context for why are we even doing this talk, and then talk about why native plants. There are a number of reasons. I'd like to go over some native plant myths. We want everybody who is going to use native plants in their yard, no matter where they live, to be successful. And then talk about recreating sort of a natural historic fabric. We'll have some resources. Ping David for resources. He's always a wealth of knowledge. If we miss something, I'm just going to give you some generals that are local for this area, but he's got a wealth of knowledge and also can probably pull up some from other places. I'm going to quick introduce myself. I do public involvement for King County Wastewater Treatment Division, but my outside life is really all about habitat restoration and wildlife. I live in Snohomish County, so I've worked with the Snohomish Conservation District a lot on both technical issues and gotten training. I go to their plant sales every year. I have a plant order in. My property is on the lower left. It's the first house I've ever owned. Um, and when I first bought it, it was pretty much open space and everything mowed down. And so I worked with the conservation district to native plant stewardship training to try to create habitat restoration as well as grow food. I used to grow hay. I'll probably switch that up. Last year I was able actually to grow food for food banks. It's really obviously a need now. So the question that we all have to ask is, why are we even talking about this subject, right? So at Brightwater, we aren't offering a workshop on how to plant exotic plants in your yard, right? But we have whole workshops on native plants. And I've been doing this for about 15 years. And so have a lot of other people and agencies and organizations talking about native plants. So to answer that, we're going to take a little bit of a trip back in time. So this is local history, but if you're from someplace else, think about the history in your area because it's probably similar to ours. Okay. So we're in Western Washington. We're on the West Coast. We have an amazingly complex geography, topography here. So we have mountains, volcanoes, rivers, creeks, and streams. We have the Puget Sound was carved out by glaciers in the last ice age. And when they melted, then salt water came in. That salt means fresh water melting from our mountains. And then there's an intermediate place, our estuaries, that are part saltwater and part freshwater. Okay, so we have all these different ecosystems in this area. And if you have a lot of different ecosystems, you can have an amazing variety of both plants and animals. And of course, people follow plants and animals. And if anybody thinks that North America was virgin wilderness when Europeans came in for the first time, it was not. It was completely covered in diverse cultures, people who had different languages, dialects, beliefs, systems. And so our area had the Coast Salish peoples and a number of different Coast Salish peoples. So again, very complex area, people living very much intertwined with the land and very much dependent on it. It was part of the sustenance for their bodies and their minds and their spirits. So this is really the Cliff's Notes of our history, very compressed. George Vancouver sailed in and found Puget Sound. A bunch of stuff happened, and then settlers started moving into the area. So if you think about how we travel today, if you're a savvy traveler, you go to a remote place, you look around, find the local people who know how to do things, and you ask them for advice. Did the Europeans who first showed up here and the settlers say, hey, look at all these thriving people. They seem to know how to interact with this rich place. We'll ask for their advice. They did not. That is not what happened historically. America tended to see the land as the house you just bought with a 1970s interior door. And they just were like, yeah, rip it all out, and maybe even tear the house down and start all over. So there wasn't a view of the richness of this land. And we also have a different view of landscapes. So for us, we tend to think of the landscape in lines, right, and geography. And so I live on a property with property boundaries. There is a line, it's surveyed, it's mine. It's not part of a larger fabric. This property can be whatever I want to express myself as and however I want to live. And as an extension, we want to live in our house one way. We started taking the outside of the house and treating it as an interior, as an outdoor room. And in an outdoor room, our plants became decorations as opposed to part of a functional landscape. So if you take a bird's eye view of an undeveloped land, it's never geometric. So land is shaped and sculpted by wind and water, and everything curves and is continuous, right? So we see the land a little bit differently. And then on my little piece of North America, I have people like to have change. We like to refresh and remodel. Nobody wants their house to look the same way. And designers and retailers are more than happy to help us keep refreshing our landscapes and our homes. And so you aren't using your yard as sort of a continuous maturing landscape or a stable landscape. It's something that you can play with and change as you want. Human beings also want what other human beings have. It's just a human being thing. We all do, right? So we had plant envy, and people brought in plants from home to recreate home. And then we want plants from other places. So I was on Kauai for a training, and we went to a native plant garden, and I looked around and I thought, this looks like the houseplant section at Home Depot. Where do you think we get our houseplants? From Hawaii? And it actually went in reverse. So I was in France a couple years ago, and I was on a number of formal, castle grounds, and I kept seeing like Oregon grape and red flowering currant. So our plants went the opposite direction because people were like, well, we don't have those, we want those. So let's talk about how it worked out. And we have a bunch of keystone species that are really, tell the story of how this all worked out. This is a quote about a plant. He found it growing on the side of a volcano and planned to use it as a beautiful ornamental plant for residential gardens. This discovery was widely celebrated, so much so that the plant was named the most interesting new ornamental plant of the year. This plant is Japanese knotweed. So this is only one of many landscape ornamentals that have escaped and done a tremendous amount of damage. So in our state, I haven't even looked up the most recent number, but several years ago, our Department of Transportation was spending $3 million a year to get it out of highway medians because it can root up through asphalt. Okay, so that didn't work out so well. We brought in stuff that escaped and did a lot of damage. Butterfly bush is another one, really well intentioned. Let's get this beautiful fragrant plant and bring it in for butterflies. It actually doesn't work well for butterflies, and it's really, really invasive. So they're coming up with less invasive cultivars, but you could also get a native plant that would work better. And I'll explain why native plants are better for butterflies. This quote is from an article slide. When you choose which plants to include in your garden, you're deciding if members of your community's local food web will be nourished or unintentionally starved, right? So we were thinking of our little plot of North America and not really thinking about ourselves as being really part of a food web for our local wildlife. And so as the plants disappeared, so did wildlife. We've lost in this area a lot of big trees. We've taken down a lot of forest. And so we've lost a lot of opportunity for animals and birds that nest in cavities of big trees. They don't have homes anymore. Our eagles, I have a pair of nesting bald eagles outside my gate. They're in a cottonwood tree. It's not their first choice. Cottonwood trees fall apart in big windstorms, but there are no big evergreens in the area for them to use. So people did bring in plants from all over, but it turned out they weren't necessarily good for wildlife. So this is a Smithsonian study, and the link is on the bottom if you want to read it. It links declines in suburban backyard birds to presence of non-native plants. Non-native plants don't host the juicy, yummy insects and caterpillars that birds need to thrive and survive and reproduce. In our area, this effect even hit the marine environment. So we have a true plant, eelgrass. It's a flowering plant that lives in the near shore. It buffers the shores so that when waves come in, they don't tear out the shorelines. And it is a nursery for Puget Sound. So everything relies on eelgrass. If we lost all our eelgrass, we would have a population crash from many other species. There are a lot of pressures on the marine environment, but loss of eelgrass to bulkheads and to invasive species and to giant docks that shade eelgrass is really problematic. I was on a King County project supporting it in communications where we did a big restoration. So the whole food web in Puget Sound depends on something that is a native plant. The good news is we can turn things around. So there is a lot of eelgrass restoration going on. They're at least holding steady, even with all the development pressure we have in our area, right? So we can turn things around and we can make them better. We're not quite there yet, right? So we're seeing more and more interest in native plants. We teach these classes, more and more people arrive. We're just not there yet. So I wish to someday be obsolete. This is my goal. If I'm obsolete, it means that everybody knows the value of native plants. They're in garden centers and yards. People know to watch for non-natives that are invasive, right? Our landscape architects, I work with a lot of them when I'm supporting projects. They have a wildlife friendly palette where they're going to hit about 70% native, and they cherish native plants for their beauty really and their place in our natural history. Before I finish this section, I want to give a big shout out. Our Coast Salish peoples were not peoples of the past. They have always been here. They are here. Their populations were reduced when settlers came in, but they are thriving. And even though they didn't impact the environment, they do a tremendous amount of environmental restoration. So you can find things online if you're here in person. This is the Burke Museum, number of the tribal governments, museums, and cultural centers. We also have fairs and festivals. There's a lot of video online. I'd recommend you go to tribal websites. And they really contribute, and they still live with the land and the water as a source of sustenance and a source of spiritual and cultural strength. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about why go native. Here's another thing I'm going to recommend you do when we can do it. And if you can do it in your area, socially distanced now, is to check out native plant demonstration gardens. So a number of the references we'll give you will have demonstration gardens. What it allows you to do is see native plants in a number of different settings and landscapes, so you can kind of see how they can fit into your own backyard. As I said, we have amazingly different topography and geography to this day, so not everything is going to work in every yard. So let's start out with at least a common understanding of what's native. This is a United States definition from the National Resources Conservation Service. A plant that is part of the balance of nature that has developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. Only plants found in this country before European settlement are considered to be native to the United States, right? So there's the cutoff before and after European settlers came. What's important to note is ecosystem. We have so many ecosystems here that some of the plants I have in my yard technically would never have been native to my area, but my area now has the ability to support the native populations because we've diked and drained. I literally live on what would have been river bottom. The thing to know about natives is to be aware of substitutes. So we tend to greenwash for marketing purposes, right? So we have some terms that kind of look like they're native. You know, it's sort of like free range. You go to buy something free range or organic, and you got to do a little bit of research because is it really free range? Is it really organic? The same thing is happening with native plants. So you're starting to see the term nativar. And what's happened is people have taken a native plant and they've selected it for some feature that they believe improves aesthetics or fragrance or form. Okay, then there's naturalized. So we say, oh, well, it kind of escaped, so maybe it's native. It's not. And then native alternative is another term that you're hearing. And you have to really think this through. Remember that not a lot of research is done on plants when they're out in the environment until you have a problem. When you have a problem is when you end up actually doing research. But there has been research done on nativars, and it's interesting if you look at the insects that are on them. So what they found is that if you change the form, so you have a more compact form so it fits in a smaller yard, you have the same complement of insects and caterpillars that you do on a larger or different form of the same plant. If you change the color, it is a totally different ball of wax. So the Pacific ninebark on the right is our native ninebark, and there's a variant called Diablo ninebark. It has this kind of reddish foliage and reddish bark. The chemicals that give it that red color actually inhibit use by insects. So it has a much lower insect population than our native form that's green. So are not, even though they act like a native and kind of look like it, they're not necessarily providing the same benefit in your yard that a native would. So one of the research studies that came out that I just cited talked about how much native, like how much native do you need to have in your yard to have a healthy insect population. And it's not just for birds, it's going to be also for amphibians and mammals, and then anything farther up the food chain. So what they came out with was about 70% native, 30% non-native. And that was enough to sustain a healthy population of birds, which means you have a healthy population of insects. So for the other 30%, what do you plant? So in our area, our water, drinking water, comes from the mountains. If you are watering your lawn, you are watering your lawn with river water that could otherwise be used by some other. Okay, so drought tolerant is great. Plus, who wants to spend the money on water? Non-invasive is super, super important. And then I really emphasize wildlife friendly. I want to be able to see wildlife. The one place I have given myself a pass, and I would say everybody else should, is if you have memorial plantings. My mother really, really loved irises. So people give me iris cultivars. They will never escape anywhere. They are extremely drought tolerant. They aren't super, the cultivars I get are not super wildlife friendly. They don't take up a lot of room in my yard, but it reminds me of my mother. So that's where I kind of give people a pass. People will say, oh, but purple coneflower down in the lower left is a native in this area. As I said, it's native to an ecosystem. It's not native to river bottoms. So for me, purple coneflower is a welcome guest and a great wildlife plant and very drought tolerant, but it's technically not native on my property. The other reason to go native is really to reduce those invasive exotics. There really is always an alternative. So butterfly bush, we have a lot of alternatives to butterfly bush. Holly in the lower left is incredibly invasive in Western Washington, and cedar waxwings love it, but they also love Oregon grape. And my Oregon grape doesn't spread. Some natives can be invasive, it's not. Right? So we have great substitutes that aren't going to take over the planet. You preserve our natural heritage. We're losing some of our native trees. Lovely. The madrone in the left has picked up 3 introduced fungi, and it's subject to urban pollution. And on the right is our Pacific dogwood that is being attacked by a fungus. And I'm sure everybody on this call, no matter where you're from, knows of things that you are losing that were grand old trees or plants that everybody's grandma remembers. And and they're part of our natural heritage. So I talked about butterfly bush not being good for butterflies. There's a very, very important reason for that. Butterflies need what are called host plants. So people think about feeding butterflies, but we want them to have the next generation and they have to lay eggs on a plant. Most plants will fend off other insects that are trying to eat them chemically. So they're trying to use chemicals to poison whatever lands on them. And over time, butterfly caterpillars have actually evolved to tolerate, to get past some of these chemicals in certain plants, but not all plants. So all plants are not host plants for all butterflies. Butterfly bush is a host plant for literally nothing. So if you don't have host plants in your yard, you can be attracting butterflies, and they're not long distance flyers in our area. Attract butterflies to your butterfly bush, they'll lay eggs on it, and then those eggs go nowhere. So you basically create a black hole in your yard for butterflies. The red admirals on the previous slide, I hate to tell you this, their host plant is stinging nettle. Stinging nettle is a great butterfly plant. Everybody tells me you can eat it when it's small. I corral my stinging nettle and keep it in a place because I am not fond of it, but it's a great butterfly plant. And there are a range of native plants that will actually work. Some non-native plants will work. You can always, no matter what area you live in, look up your butterflies, look up your host plants that are native in your area and non-native substitutes that are recommended by your butterfly association. So there are some other plants that aren't native that actually work for butterflies. So I have things like wild strawberry. This coastal strawberry in the upper right is the cultivar that was used to create a lot of domestic varieties. And then asters, but I also have coneflower, which again isn't native to my property. I get salvia a lot. Butterflies adore salvia. And it's not going to invade any place. And then I grow strawberries for food and donation myself. So if you've got strawberry cultivars, at least the butterflies will use it for nectar. They use wild strawberry as a host plant. I don't know how everybody else is doing across the country, but we're part of the big scare on losing pollinators. Bees are one of those. And so if you ignore honeybees, which are introduced for agricultural purposes, we have huge varieties of bees in our area. And they actually are more in tune to pollinating when the winds are blowing and it's stormy and stuff like that. Honeybees don't like that kind of weather. Our bees are fine with our March weather, but they also need food and they need shelter and places to raise little bees. So a lot of our native plants are really excellent bee plants, and you can find non-natives that are as well, but we've got a lot of really great plants for bees. We have not a whole lot of hummingbirds here. We are most common in my yard are the Rufus and Anna's hummingbirds. Our Anna's hummingbirds now stay year round. They didn't used to, and they stay year round. And lots of natives will work for hummingbirds. So we often think of the penstemons on the left, these tubular, purple, blue, orange, red flowers. Anything that's heath family here, so we have our native salalas in the middle that has these kind of pendulous flowers. Any plant like that works for our hummingbirds. Red flowering currant in the upper left, I told you it's been sent out to France as it starts to bloom on the west coast. So it starts from Mexico up to British Columbia. As it gets warmer, the hummingbirds use it to migrate from south to north. So they're literally following red flowering currant as it comes into bloom. They will also use blue flowers like lupins. And then our red columbine is a hummingbird favorite. Kristen showed salmonberry. Salmonberry is one of those plants that has flowers early and then it has berries early for birds. I'll talk a little bit about it. It can be invasive in the wrong conditions, but it's actually a really great plant in the rose family. We also have some twining shrubs that you can use for hummers. So people have brought in a lot of species of honeysuckle that can get really, really invasive on the West Coast. I mean, horrifically invasive, right? I taught at the zoo in their backyard habitat class for 10 years as a volunteer, and they had an amazing horticulturist there. So he had to create like ecosystems from around the world on 95 acres at the Woodland Park Zoo. And he was really in tune with that landscape. And he talked about the hummingbirds at the landscape would pass by these like big honeysuckle flowers that were fragrant and everything, and then go to the teeny little flowers of the twinberry, which is right next to this rufous hummingbird. And the reason is those big flowers are too big for them to actually get to the bottom and get any nectar. And then we've selected them really for fragrance and for color, and they weren't really selected for abundant nectar. So this twinberry, which you can train if you want, it doesn't have to grow big and free. It's a hummingbird magnet in the spring, and then it gets berries for the birds after that. So you'll find robins and cedar waxwings and all sorts of berry eating birds. Orange trumpet honeysuckle will grow in either shade or sun and put up with a lot of dry. And we have several other native honeysuckles. There are so many plant lists online, you don't need me to go through all of the plants, but know that there's a lot. The other reason to go native is you can actually eat local. We do have berry producing plants. On the left is serviceberry, and then in the middle is evergreen huckleberry. Black huckleberry is raised commercially, actually. On the right, you see high bush cranberry. Those cranberries were used by native peoples to make, it was high in vitamin C, and they would make a tart paste and put it on alder smoked salmon. So you can find a ton of references online for local berries and other local foods. I will say I always freak out when I see blackberries because we have invasive Himalayan blackberry, which I absolutely despise. We do have a native blackberry that isn't as wicked and evil as Himalayan blackberries. So now I'll switch gears again. We've talked about why go native and hopefully inspired you to kind of bring back some of nature in your area. And let's talk about native plant myths. So I started doing this, as I said, about 15 years ago. In the beginning, we would go out and talk to people and we were like, native plants are miraculous. They do everything right. That's not necessarily true. And I've made mistakes with them. So you really have to use that ethos of right plant, right place, has to apply to native plants as well. So let's go through some of the myths. This is a myth, and so some of this I'm quoting from really prominent garden experts who have gotten on the radio or had a podcast, and they're like, oh yeah, these natives, they don't work in nice gardens. We have a local, he's retired now. Russell Link is an author of Landscaping for Wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. He was a landscape architect and then went to Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he started our backyard sanctuary program. So these are two of his landscapes, and they're lovely. They can fit in almost any landscape, whether you're formal, informal. Like I said, I was walking through formal landscapes in France and seeing our natives everywhere, including Claude Monet's garden. So there are many, many different types of gardens that they can fit in. I heard another plant, very famous plant experts say, oh, they're weedy looking. We have many lovely, lovely native plants that can fit in borders. They're polite, they're elegant, they're graceful, they're exuberant. So if somebody tells you, oh, those native plants are weedy looking, not necessarily so. You can go wrong with native plants, right? So native plants, we're on small lots in cities, and there are plants you should not plant in those small lots and in cities. So some of the best wildlife plants like cottonwood trees, excellent. You can't even legally plant them in the city of Seattle. There's an ordinance that prevents it because they are really subject to wind blowdown and they'll lose big limbs, fall over. They're just dangerous. Some will root into your sewer and your water line in 10 minutes flat. Some are just too large, right? So you should be doing enough research on native plants in your area and realize they were never really developed for our lifestyle. So you have to find the ones that were and will work. We talk about right plant, right place. In the last presentation we had, we showed the house on the left. This is not a native rhododendron, but we think of that, but you need to think of it about on native plants. So on the trying to take a sword fern out. So I planted it and it was too large and starting to crowd a path. It took me a month in the wintertime to dig this thing out. It was so huge. And then it weighed so much. The only thing I could do was sit down on my butt and roll it out with my feet onto a tarp, drag the tarp across the yard, and roll it back into another hole. I will tell you, sword ferns are so resilient that it did just fine. It's survived and it's beautiful now. You need to, as you think about right plant, right place, really look carefully and research the size. So native plants, as I said, they kind of grew into an ecosystem. It's not that they can't grow into another ecosystem. A lot of them are fairly plastic, but they may have a different form and get to a different size. So a lot of times with Pacific crabapple, which is one of my absolute favorites, it says, oh, it's going to be a thicket that's 10 or 15 feet tall. Okay. Then you find the reference that says it can reach up to 30. In dry conditions, it will be a tree. I have one growing outside my house and I do love it. So I'm on remote work. I'm in my upstairs office and I'm looking out house and I see cedar waxwings eating the berries. So it worked out fine in that case, but do know that sometimes the plants can be larger than life or they can grow in a different form. Salmonberry, which Kristen and I both showed, exact same thing. If it's really wet, they can turn it into a 10-foot tall thicket. I have it growing dry along the dike where it doesn't get a lot of water, and they're about 4 feet tall and they're in a polite little row. So you want to do some research on that. There's so many more myths. You could go on for a whole presentation on that. Native plants love our native soil. So we used to say they'll grow anywhere. No, they won't. Remember we had all those ecosystems? They all came with kind of unique soil profiles. And then we tore everything out and removed that soil. If you ever go on a native plant salvage, I got an early on tip from the pros, pull some soil with it because there are certain microorganisms that are in there and the soil type you'll want to replicate in your yard. Some of them are really, really tolerant of different conditions, and some of them are just distinctly not. You have to have the right soil. They can get disease. A lot of it is introduced. I just got viburnum leaf beetle, which came from Asia last year. It's moved into Snohomish County, and I'm going to need to get help from the Extension Service to get rid of it. So they can get disease. Incense cedar can give other plants rust, not always, but sometimes. They can be invasive. I talked about salmonberry being invasive. I love Nootka rose, but don't plant it by a lawn because it's going to want to come up through everything. So you'll want to check and make sure that your native plants are going to take over your yard. So now I'm going to talk about like how do we recreate our natural fabric, the fabric that we used to have here. So instead of having these little isolated pieces, what can we do to recreate natural fabric and still have the yards that we want? So woodlands, forests has disappeared from this area a lot. We can't all grow giant evergreen or deciduous trees in our yards, right? There are, I talked about nativars that are smaller in form. If you have them in your area, that may be suitable to give you evergreen trees for perches and places for your wildlife to hang out when the weather's bad. Shade tolerant understory, we have a lot of big trees, things will grow under them. I have stuff growing everywhere. And then a rich organic layer. So you see this frog in the lower right is in my yard and there's a whole bunch of dead leaves and wood chips and stuff for him to stay cool and happy and enjoy himself. So a lot of our natives work in a forest understory. They're used to being in the shade. And in fact, some of them hate the sun. So I'll flip back if you look on the lower left, the wood sorrel, the carpet of kind of clover looking ground cover, that actually hates the sun. You'll find it start to curl up in the sun. And if you get a lot of sun, it will die. So in our forest understory, we have things like false lily the valley. We have a red huckleberry that will grow. It likes to be in woody soils or will grow out of stumps in forest. And then on the right, you have a low version of Oregon grape and bunchberry. Bunchberry we have a ground cover, a shrub, and a tree that are all in the dogwood family. And bunchberry gets really nice red berries around Christmas time. So there are a lot that you can have in forest understory. You can replicate our sunny areas, our coastal plains, our bluffs, our beach areas with trees that will work in sunny yards. Our vine maple in the lower left actually can do well both in shade and in sun. It tends to get prettier fall color in the sun, but it will work well in the shade as well. In the upper left is one of my favorites, Cascara. It actually has a pretty form for yard trees, and cedar waxwings and other birds really love the berries. I get a lot of nests in them. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's nearby food source. Black hawthorn is a tree that will support, it's thorny, so it's great because cats can't climb it. So if you have people's cats wandering around your yards and you're trying to protect your birds, thorny stuff is a great way to deter them. And you'll see black hawthorn with a lot of nests in it as well. I talked about our madrone with the peeling bark. It's a very generous tree, can be a little bit messy, but it's a really, really lovely tree in the sun with well-drained soil. We have a lot of shrubs. The left is the California wild lilac. We have a lot of ceanothus. Again, they are not going to be endemic to my area at all, but I have them because they're great bee plants. And on the right, I have mock orange. So mock orange has a gorgeous citrus scent, and it is found more commonly in eastern Washington, but it is also found in western Washington. And it's a great landscape plant and it attracts a lot of pollinators to it. And citrus eat. You're trying to replicate forests, you can find things that will do fine in the shade. Our red osier dogwood or red twig dogwood on the left. So in the upper left, you see the flowers. In the lower left, you see the winter twigs. It's nice for seasonal color. If we were out at the Brightwater Center, you would see that our gardeners trim it. And if you prune it, and you can shape it, it's perfectly happy because it's used to being eaten by herbivores, by elk and deer and creatures we don't even necessarily have here anymore. So you'll trim it, it'll stay red. It can double flower where it flowers in the spring and then flowers again in the fall if it gets enough rain. So we have plants like that. Our orange trumpet honeysuckle will wind up without actually harming your trees. The vines will wind up through the trees. And then in the upper right, you see our Indian plum, which will probably start to bloom in about February. And then it has a plum, which you won't eat. This one isn't super edible, but which the wildlife will absolutely love. So you can create a forest understory with a lot of different plants. The other thing I always think about is perch availability. So one of the maples that people bring in is like the heavy umbrella style Japanese maple. Well, if you're a bird, you kind of want to be able to perch in different places and look for, friends and enemies and kind of keep an eye on things. You can't actually do that with a Japanese maple. So they do give you seasonal color, but our native vine maple actually has seasonal color and it's a great, elegant perching plant for birds. So we all have that grass is greener urge, right? We want stuff from other places. So here's a novel idea. We have so many ecosystems here. Think about creating another Pacific Northwest ecosystem in your yard. So here's one option, and you can get these plants locally, is to create an alpine rock garden. And there is University of Washington has a video on this webpage that will tell you exactly how to create an alpine rock garden or you have a planter strip and you're in Seattle and it's super sunny and you have to maintain your planter strip. What about making it an Eastern Washington shrub step garden, right? So if we want to have plants from other places, maybe bring them from the same ecosystems in our region so that if stuff does spread, it will be welcome wherever it goes. The other thing we like is remodeling and refreshing, right? And I talked about that saying, well, you don't then have kind of mature ecosystem for the wildlife in your area. Well, here's an option to that. Okay, you can have mature elements like older trees and shrubs, but then you can use hanging baskets. You can use flower beds, pots. Styles of pots change all the time, right? So you can actually change up your yard or change the style of your paths and have that refresh and remodel without actually losing the habitat value in the yard at the time. Hedgerows are phenomenal for wildlife. I've traveled in Scotland and they had amazing hedgerows. They are losing their hedgerows to development. Hedgerows are really helpful. I have wood fencing. You can see it in the lower left. Wood fencing is super expensive and really a pain to install, and it rots, right? So, and I don't want mine treated because chemicals, environment, and wildlife, not a good thing. But a hedgerow, so I'm literally trying around the outside of my property to create a hedgerow. It will keep my neighbor's cows out, which is a goal of mine. And then it will also provide wildlife habitat. So if you're looking for a project, think about a hedgerow instead of a fence. And we have a lot of native plants that would work well in hedgerow. You're looking at mock orange in the picture coming over the fence. Our Nootka rose, which I told you don't plant right by a lawn, well in hedgerow that's distant from someplace that you use. The second picture from our left is our native snowberry, and it is very drought tolerant, very durable, and hummingbirds love the flowers. And then our native tall Oregon grape, which has really nice flowers in the spring, great bee plant, and then has berries that the cedar waxwings love so much. So you can build a really varied hedgerow, literally flowers throughout from spring to fall, and then create a barrier and some habitat. Here's another novel idea if you're looking for a project. Our native peoples actually farmed camas lily. It has a starchy root, and they had their camas meadows were divided up into family plots, and every plot was maintained by a family. And so it gave them a source of starch that could store over the winter. So grow a camas meadow. This does take some effort, but you can actually do it. There's a couple down in Columbia River Gorge, and when they're not flowering, they look like the world's most well-kept and beautiful lawn. When they are flowering, they're this gorgeous light purple color. In this area, you have a great opportunity to create wet places. We have a local author, Kelly Brenner. I've been to her house. We've exchanged plants. She wrote the book Nature Obscura to get people to celebrate their urban wildlife. I have pictures of her pond, but I'm not going to show her property for privacy purposes. But she has the most incredible pond in a small lot in Seattle, and it has incredibly rich life in it. So we have an opportunity because there's so much water on the West Coast coming out of the sky all the time during the winter to create some really nice wet places. I have seen people who have boggy areas on their property actually create small wetlands. So you can get plants, native plants that work well in small wetlands. Cattails can get invasive, but actually a lot of birds they eat the seeds, but they use the fluff for nesting material. This is in the middle, swamp lantern or skunk cabbage. Is insects love it. It's an early arriver in our swamps in the spring. And on the right, you see Mirica gale. The flower of Mirica gale is not really that attractive, but this is a great butterfly plant. And again, it's going to come in early, and it's a nitrogen fixer. So if you have really bad soil, it's going to fix nitrogen in the soil. And then our sluice sedge you're seeing much more commonly in the lower left. Birds absolutely love it, and it has a lot of structure for bird nests and can create great erosion control. We have plants that will grow in wet conditions everywhere. I've talked about our red twig dogwood. We have stream violets. Our Nootka rose, you see it, like I said, don't plant it by your lawn, but it just loves wet areas. And if you're looking for thorny barriers to protect your wildlife, places where birds can nest, Our goldfinches are like this. They like to nest in thorny, dense areas so that their nests are safe from intruders eating eggs and young. On the lower left is our maidenhair fern. It is one of my favorite ferns. It has our sword ferns are great. They're great for structure. They have big, deep roots, and they're great for erosion control. But our native, some of our native ferns are a little bit more delicate, and maidenhair has this jet black stem, and it's really, really a pretty plant. It wants to be in shade. So those of you who are like, I have all this shade, we have plants for shade, and it likes it to be a little bit soggy. So we will have lots of time for questions, but I really want to encourage you, if you're going to bring in native plants, you're going to start to bring in wildlife. And if you bring in wildlife, I'm really going to encourage you to do pest control on sort of natural level. Integrated pest management is what we call it here, rather than start to spray everything. With my viburnum leaf beetle, I will bring a sample to WSU Extension and they will help me with a treatment for the beetle because we don't want it to spread any farther than it's already spread, but it won't harm the rest of my wildlife. So what I don't want to do is spray every single leaf with a caterpillar on it with pesticide, because if you think about it, a lot of other wildlife's going to come along and get poisoned and die. So I'd encourage you, if you're thinking about integrating native plants in your yard, you are going to attract our local wildlife, even if you're not doing it for wildlife, but for other reasons. Do think about natural pest control. I'm a big fan of raptors. They eat a lot of rodents. I have perches and nest boxes everywhere for this purpose. I have a lot of owls that come around as well. Insect eating birds. Actually, our Anna's hummingbirds eat aphids. So if you're not treating plants for aphids, your Anna's hummingbird will be very, very happy to get your aphids because it's a good source of protein and fat. Dragonflies, if you're not treating in ponds, dragonflies will pick up mosquito larvae. And then our garter snakes, I actually have a great video of a garter snake tearing through the garden with a giant slug in its mouth, right? So we have a lot of native pest control that we can use, and then just being thoughtful about pest control when you have native plants, because you are going to get wildlife. So I'm going to go into resources, then David and I will answer questions. So sorry, David, I stole your slide. David's on the lower left, talking to people for the Snohomish Conservation District. So this list shows you they do a tremendous amount of things. They also have an annual native plant sale. I unfortunately ordered too late, so a lot of the stuff I wanted was gone. So I now have orders into conservation districts in 3 different counties. You do not have to live in a county to order from them. The problem for you is you're going to have to drive to go pick them up. But they have figured out even how to do native plant sales with COVID and have socially distanced pickup. But if you are in Snohomish County, they do a lot more than that. And then every county has a conservation district. And I'll let David talk more at the end about what the conservation district does. I talked about Washington Native Plant Society. I am a native plant steward, but I have such a limited knowledge because of my focus on wildlife. They have a lot of activities, a lot of folks, a huge number of, or a huge amount of plant information. For those of you that are from somewhere else, if you know of a plant society in your state or your country, feel free to put it in the chat for others, right? There are a lot of native plant societies. They also are a good source of native plants that you can't find other places. So the native plant stewards will actually, you have to get permits to harvest native plants, and they'll cultivate native plants, and then they'll have fundraiser plant sales. So they'll donate those plants. And then you have these people with this incredible knowledge to tell you how to make those plants successful. So I don't know that they're going to do plant sales this year with the pandemic, but do know that you should watch them because you can get stuff that you would get nowhere else at the Native Plant Society sales. We have Native Plants Northwest is a great website that can help people in the Northwest. And then King County has a native plant guide. So you can actually go on and look for the conditions in your yard. So this isn't sorted by ecosystems so much, but by conditions in your yard. And it'll give you lists of plants that would work there and how big or small they are. And then whether they require a lot of water or a little water, things like that. So you'll find a lot of information there. So I want to say thank you. I think we did it, even with the tech issues. We've got a good 25 minutes to answer questions. So if David can unmute himself.
Yes, I can.
Hey.
I want to speak really quickly on one talking about siskins and salmonella outbreaks and bird feeders. That is an issue. I actually have a friend who just had to take down her feeders for that reason. There's a lot of things that you can do to bypass that there or to try to protect your feeders. The main issue that's coming from that is that since it's transmitted through the feces, there are several birds that will use and defecate at the same time, and then it'll be spread through the seed. There's a few different ways that you can fix that, including cages, including modifying the structure that they're actually sitting on, or cleaning them regularly. I'm not qualified to go into that. What I would suggest is coming back for our talk on native species and native species gardening, where one of my friends, who's a wonderful birder and has several bird feeders in her backyard, will probably be a better person to ask that question. And I'm actually, Kristen, that's a week from 2 weeks from today, right?
Yes. Well, it's no. So the next class is about sustainable gardening.
Oh, okay.
On I guess that would be February 6th. I have to look back.
Okay.
So it's the following class. I believe it's February 23rd, something like that.
Okay.
On
David,
landscaping for wildlife.
Yeah, and I can add something to that. So several years ago, you would not believe how big of a storm this set off. Fish and Wildlife came out and recommend people take down their feeders because there was an eye fungus going around. And so people were like, we can't do this. This would be horrible. So Fish and Wildlife started to do sort of some education about feeders. It's not only disease passage, but you start to get into a situation where it's artificial, right? So we're all gathered at the water cooler chatting and we're distracted, or it's like the free food in the lunchroom. We don't have that anymore because we're all at home, but we have free food in the lunchroom. Everybody shows up. Well, if you're a predator, this is easy picking. So we in this area get Coopers and sharp-shinned hawks that just get trained to your bird feeders. And you really put the birds at disadvantage because they're fighting for food. So they had those issues as well. And then you would have things like crows would show up and they would, grab stuff that fell on the ground and then go eat an egg or a baby. So you are creating a bit of an artificial situation. And Fish and Wildlife started asking people to take their feeders down during nesting season. And then also consider putting in some food sources that weren't a concentration of high nutrition food at a feeder. So again, stepping back from a specific issue at a feeder is really questioning, and we'll talk about that in the landscaping for wildlife, really questioning what value you're providing. Do you want to provide habitat or do you want to concentrate animals at a nutritious food source?
Yeah, I will second that. Anything that you can, no plant is doing just one thing. It's usually providing food in one case, habitat for another, child rearing for another. It's doing a lot of different things, and it's always preferable to try to create sort of a mini ecosystem or a patch habitat than it is to just be solely providing one thing as a general rule. As an urban habitat person, let me also say, if you think, oh, well, my backyard is just, it's too tiny, It's not going to be valuable enough. There's not enough room for me to do different things. I strongly push back on that. There's several types of habitat, and patch habitat, which is, little backyard areas, even just, a balcony with some milkweed for butterflies, is hugely beneficial to sort of use as for species to use as a rest stop while they're going between larger matrix habitats. So strongly recommend coming back for that class. I'm not teaching in that one, but I'm going to be tuning in just to watch it because I'm really excited about the subject matter. And of course, if you are in Snohomish County, please contact the Conservation District. We'd be happy to talk more about your specific yard.
And so David, the one thing, do you want to cover, because this applies to everybody no matter where you're at, there are different ways to acquire native plants. So you can get them from groups and organizations, commercial sources, harvest in the wild. Do you want to kind of cover the do's and don'ts on that piece?
Yeah, Monica is queuing me up because right before we got on online, I was on my own little personal tirade about people harvesting in the wild. So there are several wonderful places to acquire plants. There are native nurseries, which a lot of I think there's a misconception that a lot of bulk native nurseries are not open to the public. Many of them are. Some of them their license doesn't allow them to, but in many cases they are. Please look them up and contact them and find out if they are. They are often not only a place where you can really make sure that anything that you are buying has a correct provenance, that the seeds were sourced sustainably, that they're genetically diverse, but also they're usually the least expensive. And instead of going to some of these larger boutique places, native plant societies do their own sales usually. I saw someone mention Untitled Chapter 2. That's mine. I love those guys. They do a great sale every year. Conservation districts do sales every year. This year, we decided to go the Snohomish Conservation District decided to go entirely pre-orders, and we had over 1,000 orders in the first 3 days, which basically wiped out our stock. We weren't quite anticipating that much interest. But there's you don't have to be a member of that or a resident of that county in order to use that. You can go to King, you can go to Pierce, you can go to Skagit, you can go wherever. The last thing is that back in the before times, there were often what was called wild harvesting events, where somebody would specifically go out to an area that was going to be developed, and they would try to harvest as many of the native species as possible before the area was like bulldozed and turned into, I don't know, probably another Amazon warehouse. And that was done basically to try to save as much of the biodiversity in that plot as possible. And it was usually kind of understood that at the end of that, after everything was sort of potted up, some people were going to go home with some of those plants. It's an opportunity to be out with people, learn some stuff, because usually the folks out there are very knowledgeable, and then also to get some plants to take home. This evolved into something that was kind of not great, which is people will just go into parks now and start pulling plants out. Please don't do this. As somebody who does a lot of installations in parks, me and my crew are tired of our plants going missing. I really want to stress that anytime you are trying to harvest plants, you need to have somebody who is knowledgeable enough to tell you for certain what you're harvesting, that it is healthy, that you're not transplanting something terrible, and also somebody who is giving you permission to be there and do that. I definitely, I feel it. There's a plot near my place that is getting ready to be turned into condos, and I know that there is specifically this one beautiful mock orange that is in there, and I desperately want to go in and rescue it, but I can't because it's very illegal, and it could cause a whole lot of other problems. So please do not pull plants out. Please do not go harvesting in the wild. I promise that there are societies and nurseries and opportunities near you that would love to have, when the world opens up again, they would love to have an extra pair of hands as a volunteer, and they would love somebody to talk to plants about, or talk to about plants and share some of their wisdom. So Elaine just said one of our neighbors put up a sign saying, "Please take this plants before the plot is redeveloped." That is I certainly hope that your neighbor that is their plot, and they are saying, "Please come into my yard and do that." If somebody can do that, great. If you have friends that are saying, I have all these plants, please come take some of them and whatever. Great, awesome. You should definitely feel free to do that. Plant exchanges are super fun. Oh, seed swaps are another thing. I think for a long time, seed swaps have kind of been like, for food seeds and gardening seeds, introduced ornamental species. I think that a lot of them are transitioning towards having a lot of natives in them, just because they want people to engage with that. I would also, and I'm just remembering something else, I would also talk to whoever your local municipality is. A lot of times while they are doing park maintenance, they will end up with their own seeds, or their own greenhouse stock. And sometimes they get it donated, or they just have too much and aren't using them and they need to get rid of it. I won't say the name of the municipality, but in college, I was doing a restoration project and desperately needed like 50 sword fern. And one municipality happened to contact me and say, "We have thousands of sword fern that we can't get rid of. How many do you want?" And I ended up with a bunch of sword fern that I was able to put in at a Brightwater project, actually. So it's there's a lot of places to talk to. The number one takeaway is, please just don't go out into the wild and start ripping out flowers that you think are nice. They're probably going to die, and two, you're not going to do any favors.
So I can add on to that a little bit. Snohomish County had a couple of organizations doing native plant salvages. We had a program for years that did native plant salvages, and a lot of the plants came from my yard. Unfortunately, the program died when the person who was running it retired, so it hasn't been revived. There is a lot of liability work you have to do if you're going to bring volunteers on a site. However, the sensibility about salvaging plants is still there. So I have a project in Bellevue where we're going to take out a trailhead. We have to do a sewer pipe project, but there's a lot of native plants that are salvageable. So we talked to the city and said, "Should we salvage them for you?" And they said, "No, actually, we'd like you to do education events, salvage plants, and give them so that they end up in Bellevue backyards," right? So there are other opportunities. Somebody mentioned that they had a neighbor who put a sign up and said, "Please come take the plants." So salvage still can occur. You'll find a lot of developers are a little uncomfortable about it because of the liability of people on their property wielding tools, and what if they get injured. But sometimes the contractors, if you can arrange with them, they're going to pull the plants out, and if they're durable enough, you can actually just grab them on the site. So salvage is an option. Again, don't do it in the wild unless you have a permit. You need a permit in our forest areas and stuff to start pulling plants. I do not need to do this, but I do this, and I really want to emphasize it. I will buy some plants at local like garden centers. Why am I doing that? I want them to stock native plants, and they won't stock native plants if people don't buy them. They're a lot more expensive and I have too much space, but I actually make a habit every year of doing that. The other consideration you need to think about is genetic diversity. So our oxbow farms down by the Snoqualmie River actually harvests in the wild with permits in order to maintain genetic diversity. And you'll find that for a lot of the folks that are propagating for the conservation district sales and things like that, most of us who have native plants grow and they spread themselves, right? We're dividing and giving away. So I've been dividing and giving away to people for literally years, right? I've given away to master gardener sales and things like that. When we were meeting at Brightwater, I would divide all winter and then try to bring stuff in. If we didn't have snowstorms or wacky things happen beforehand, I would bring them in and give them away. So the nice thing is if you can inspire people in your area, wherever you live in this country, outside of the country, if you can inspire others, you can then start to do like community plant swaps and shares and make it more local and kind of a neighbor thing to do. So then you're increasing that fabric of native plants through the area, plus you're kind of interacting with everybody else and then getting free plant samples from them. So those are just some ideas for acquiring. The other thing, so David talked about harvesting from restoration sites. The other thing is don't go eat there. So Discovery Park in Seattle was doing a lot of native plant restoration. There was an old military facility that was taken out. People in the locavore movement, where you're going to eat native stuff, were literally coming into their restoration when their plants were immature and eating them, and then the plants would die. So just be thoughtful again when you're harvesting. Make sure that you're on a legal spot if you're going to be eating native plants.
I also suggest, I'm a big fan of, you know, blackberry. I love blackberries. I mean, I hate blackberry, but I love picking blackberries as I walk by in the summer. If you were going to do that, to put them in the container, go home and then rinse them. Especially a lot of property management places, they don't want to try to tear out or grub out blackberries, so they'll just walk by and spray it. So just, you know that you might be accidentally eating pesticide. Something else, just to go back, and this is my own opinion, Monica may push back on me on this. If you buy from a big box store, try to bare root them from the potting soil before you plant them, and also try to rinse out the leaves before putting them in the ground, and then water them in. There are still places, Home Depot is one of them, that use that use toxic pesticides and fertilizers. And toxic is a terrible term, but they may pose a threat to birds and pollinators unless that initial surface spray is rinsed off. It won't be that way for very long, but I suggest that nothing wrong with going out and buying from a store, but do give them a good spritz before you actually put them down in your yard, just for Mr. B who wants to land there and try to eat something off one of the leaves.
We have some questions
Yes.
that we need to address. There was one a little while back about what are some good native evergreens to plant. This person lives in Bremerton.
So we have things like dwarf Alberta spruce. You can actually get, so don't ever go to the mountains and harvest these, but I have gotten subalpine fir from the conservation district. So our lowland firs get to be, 150 feet tall. Subalpine fir tends to stay much more short and compact. So there are a number of species that are going to be a little bit more doable in a yard for evergreens. And don't think of evergreens as always trees. They may be shrubs. If you need to have evergreens in your yard, you can have shrubs. The other thing to know, natives can be pruned, and I have seen people take incense cedar, which is an evergreen, and it is incredibly drought tolerant, and much more so than juniper actually. And you can actually prune it into a hedge. It is a host plant for cedar hairstreak butterflies, so it does have habitat value and you'll get nests in it. But you can take some of our evergreens and actually just cut the tops off and they'll be perfectly fine. Cedars are really famous for that.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then I saw another question about the lawn alternatives. So we're talking about clover and moss were good lawn alternatives to plant. Are there any native clover and moss species that you would recommend?
Not really, none that I know of in terms of clover. There is, if you get the white clover nutrient with the nitrogen coating, it will root extremely quickly. It doesn't really spread. It's not necessarily an invasive. It is a non-native. I've been recommending that for a while. I have not had anybody have an issue with non-native clovers. If you're looking for native ground covers that are going to do something similar, there are a lot of those, but they're not going to be that same kind of like uniform green that you get from turf grass.
All right. And then Wesley is looking at his yard right now. And wondering if there are some natives that are green year round, and certain natives like maidenhair, twinberries, high bush cranberry, salmonberry, are they evergreen or do they brown and drop leaves in the winter?
So a lot of ours are deciduous, but we also have a lot of evergreens. So you have things like our tall Oregon grape is an evergreen and makes a great hedgerow, as I've mentioned. Some of the ones that do drop, like our red twig dogwood, actually have gorgeous color in the wintertime, and we're so gray and gloomy right now. I really super appreciate it. I don't have the sun that other people have right now. I'm in a river valley and I have fog. So my little hedgerow of red twig dogwood is great. But yeah, there are some evergreen varieties of both shrubs and trees and ground covers that you can find that are native. So they don't necessarily have to be evergreen trees, but they could be another form.
Yes, and high bush cranberry does lose its leaves, so
Yes, it
that's
does.
normal if that's what's happening to your plant.
Yeah.
And then there was a question that just got put in the chat. I have to scroll down. If
Are there
there's
native?
any native plants that are toxic to cats or other pets.
Yes. But we need to be a little bit more specific. Are you talking about plants that you are going to plant in your yard? Your cat is an outdoor cat. Or are you talking about like plants that you would like to have as kind of a house plant?
I bet they're outdoor.
Okay. There are several. I don't think I'm going to be able to just list all of them off. Instead, I'm going to see if I can actually track down um, a website that I sent to somebody just a little while ago. So I will come back to that. There are most of them are things that you probably wouldn't have cats eating anyway.
That's what I would say. Yeah, there's a lot of these that technically, so one of our native plants is poison hemlock. It is the most poisonous or most toxic plant in North America. Like nothing will eat it. In fact, it can cause respiratory distress. We had a King County crew that was trying to cut it down and actually had respiratory symptoms, right? Most of these you're not going to start eating. Red elderberry is one of those where the berries are really beloved by birds. They can technically be eaten by people, but not until they're cooked. You can get sick from them. Interestingly, there's a lot of misunderstandings about this. So when I first started, snowberry, which has a white berry, was the headline botanical book was like, it's called corpseberry by Native Americans for a reason. It's really toxic. Then it turned up that wasn't necessarily so true. So yeah, and then I see death camas is coming up. It's a white camas instead of a purple one. So yes, there are some things that can be not good. Never eat mushrooms in the Pacific Northwest, please, before you learn your mushrooms. When I was in Minnesota in college, 4 people died out here barbecuing what is it called? Deadly nightshade. No, nightcap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually studied mushrooms for the University of Washington Environmental Science Lab, and I don't eat mushrooms without
Yeah, I don't either.
a book next to me. There are edible mushrooms, but you do not risk it. There was a joke that we used to have, which is all mushrooms are edible once. As a general kind of blanket, oleander, lily, ivy, tulips, and daffodils are toxic, and things in that family are toxic. But again, you probably shouldn't. It's unlikely your cat's going to be in the position to want to try to eat those. Like people will say, you'll have people have like peace lilies and stuff as house plants is a little bit different because like they don't have cat grass or catnip for cats to also go and graze on. And so the cats end up eating the lilies and getting sick. If you're feeding your cat well and you're providing opportunities, I don't think that you're going to have too much of a problem.
All right. Is holly toxic?
Holly is not toxic, but the leaves in holly will rip up the digestive system pretty bad, and the berries are basically inedible.
Yeah. So there are some plants that actually, like yarrow is, I couldn't have it near my horse pastures. So the conservation district has a farming section and they can talk to you about which native plants, lupin as well. The seeds can be toxic. So for livestock, if you've got pet goats or whatever, I'm not a goat person, but I had horses and I knew I had to be sensitive about some native plants around my horses.
Yeah. Yeah, please. Yeah, we've got a whole list of stuff of why you shouldn't, what you shouldn't plant and why.
David, do you see the most recent question in the
Heavy
chat?
clay. Yeah.
Yeah, about
Uh,
saving the bare root plants from the plant sale
yeah.
in pots and planting the following fall.
I do
I
that
mean,
every year. I'm just
yeah.
going to say you do have to tend them, but what it allows them to do, because I have big property, right? You saw it. So it allows them to build roots, and then I plant them during the wet season now. And then that way they get some free water while they're going through transplant shock. And then they can kind of, and they don't have leaves that they have to support during that transplant period. So most of mine actually, if they aren't near the house where I can baby them, most of mine go into pots and then they go into the ground in the fall.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I don't think I would. I think I would probably keep them out and then try to plant them no later than the end of September, or no earlier than the end of September.
Yeah, the exception would be like little meadow type plants, right? So if you were lucky and got in earlier than I did and got the cute little plants that go into planter beds, because you're going to maintain planter beds and water them a little bit more. So,
Yeah,
so that makes it easier.
yeah, that's, I guess that is the caveat, is you can plant at any time. You just have to be prepared to be watering every single day, to make sure that they establish well. I don't recommend it because, one, it's really labor intensive, and two, just because, like, if they're leafing out, you're going to have a higher shock than when they're in kind of their dormancy. But if you're at a point where you say, this is the only time that the ground is dry enough for me to plant, then, give it a shot. I would just plan on plan on some die-off, so buy extras.
Yeah, and this obviously is going to be very geographically restricted. We have people from Canada and Minnesota who are going to be like under snow right now. So you're
Yeah.
probably envying the fact that we can plant during the winter, but you can get revenge on us knowing that our mild winters are why we have so many pesty weeds. But yeah, you'll want to consult a local expert on plant timing. But for the Pacific Northwest, the whole region, aside from east of the mountains where it is going to be snowy, the planting season is kind of when you can catch the rain, but they don't have leaves. Like David said, you don't want to be supporting leaves and trying to make roots at the same time.
Yeah.
All right. So I just want to acknowledge that it's officially time to end class. So I want to be mindful of people that want to leave, but I see there are a couple of questions in the chat. So if you do need to leave, I just want to let you know that, well, first, thank you for being here. It was great to have everyone here at this class. And if you'd like to join the other upcoming classes, the next one will be on sustainable gardening, featuring a new speaker from the Snohomish Conservation District on February 6th, so in 2 weeks. And then our final class is there's 3 more. So then our class after that is about landscaping for wildlife specifically. And Monica and another wildlife biologist from the Snohomish Conservation District will be teaching that class on February 20th. And then our final class will be on March 6th. And that is all about managing and learning to live with, in some cases, yard and garden pests and nuisances. So that's what's coming up. So hopefully we'll see you there. I will be emailing out the link to this class for the recording and also the PDF versions of all the slides. So you will get those resources next week at some point. So if you do need to leave, feel free to go. And then I don't know, Monica and David, if you want to just answer those 2 questions.
I saw the one on soil, what to pot them in. Is that one of the ones you're looking at?
Yes.
Okay, so what I usually do, you need to be a little careful with soil. because a lot of times people are getting yard waste clippings and things like that to make compost and then make soil mixes. So you want to make sure that they've got some way of testing. We had compost that, this is a long time ago, there was a pesticide used in Eastern Washington. It was actually a feed through to keep weeds down. So they would feed cattle this pesticide. Then, you know, when they pooped, it would inhibit weed growth from their poop. Unfortunately, it ended up surviving long enough to be in compost that got mixed into soil or just sold as compost and killed a lot of plants over on the west side. So you'll want to make sure that wherever you're getting soil from, you're careful about. I tend to bulk buy soil, but I've also bought bags of soil. I have paid extra to have organic, okay, and to research who's actually making that soil and how regulated it is, just because I'm not really sure what's going into bagged soil. Whatever you do for soil, the one tip I've gotten from our restorationist, which has worked beautifully for me, and I'm going to have to spell this in the chat, is to add back organisms that would normally be in soil. When you get fresh soil, it's kind of all jumbled up and you're getting a lot of oxygen in there and stuff, and it's not mature soil. So mature soil, you'll start to see mushrooms growing in our area. So it's not mature soil and it doesn't have a mature organism base. So you can buy what mycorrhizae, so and little bacterial mixes of normal soil organisms. I have found that to be a phenomenal help for me with bare plants, especially to help them. They're often picking up nutrients and it helps with water flow in the plant. And it's really protected them in droughty seasons. I got total religion about this because somebody at work recommended it. And I was planting spruce, so our native spruce. Native spruce needs to be on wet ground, and it actually during the summer does not go dormant. Most of our evergreens in Western Washington go dormant. Spruce doesn't, so it keeps losing moisture through the needles. That's why it has to be on wet ground. And we had a horrible drought that year, horrible. And I had these barrettes, and I thought, well, that's the end of that. But I had put them in with just kind of the soil I buy from my trusted source, a little bit of compost and mycorrhizae, and they did brilliantly. And I talked to our restorationist, and she said, yeah, that's why we're using it everywhere, using mycorrhizae mixes. And they're going to be marketed to your area. You can look online, and you'll have to do a little bit of research on what mixes you get. But that's what I would say for potting soil, and I put it in the pots when I plant them.
Okay, great. If we weren't able to answer any of your questions, you will be given access to Monica and David via email when I do send out the resources. So feel free to contact them if you have any other questions. But for now, we do need to end our class. So thank you again for everyone for being here, and we will hopefully see you in another class. Have a good Saturday.